Ladies and gentlemen, Nick thinks that we are passionate but wrong. We think they're even more passionate but even wronger. We're going to tell you a lot of things today. We're going to prove to you how the entire argument on how journalism uses social media does not disprove the fact that this whole idea of verification and truth is passing away. That the accuracy of media is being eroded or becoming unnecessary because of the fact that the sources that journalists use are speaking to the public directly. That is what we are going to contend. So I'm going to talk about two major things today. First, we're going to start a long list of rebuttal on how our opponents are wrong, as Nick loves to say. And second, I'm going to move on to the idea of distributing information. Why we think that social media works on a much larger scale. Why we think it also encourages a lot of people to actively participate in discussing social issues. And why that is also taking over the role of journalists themselves. So let's begin with this whole idea of rebuttals. Let's start with the whole idea of fact-checking. Now, at the very beginning of my first speaker, Natalie's speech, Rachel came up and she basically said, you know, in Whitney Houston's case, it was only after AP's report of the event that people started retweeting the event. Now, we would contend this by basically saying actually many events don't rely on official news sources anymore to actually start retweeting. People do believe those things because, for example, the family members of Whitney Houston were already tweeting about the event straight afterwards. When Pope Francis became the Pope, it was broken on Twitter, and we saw 130,000 tweets per minute on Twitter going around. There was no such thing as relying on the official news source, because we saw photos of the Pope walking out saying that I am the Pope. Why would I need a journalist to tell me that he is the Pope, right? Especially in this kind of age, where people want to find out information themselves, where they disapprove of these kinds of journalists who they believe belong to the establishment and belong to particular political perspectives. This is where individuals are striving to find out information on their own.
Point of
what we're
information.
contending here, no, thank you, Rachel. What we are actually contending here is that journalists are actually amplifiers now, but not the creators and collectors of information anymore. The second thing that Nick talked about was the idea of the end of a phase. He talked about how telegraphs were used, when 100 words, how we get to information as quickly as possible. We contend that this is no longer important, because the key difference is that professional journalists are the people who use these telegraphs to collect information in the past, but now on social media, 140 words are written by the sources themselves, by Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, by Boko Haram in Nigeria. All of these kinds of terrorists who didn't have these tools to connect to people from the very first place, they are speaking directly to us. We don't need people to gather telegraphs and then write in tomorrow's newspaper. The third one, they talked about this whole idea of collecting information. Well, we say that yes, journalists are collecting information in the same way as Nick conceded. So the question is verification. What do journalists have that is unique to them? What we're saying here is that firstly, the trust in journalists is being continually eroded. All these kinds of affairs with Rupert Murdoch being part of the establishment, the idea that they promote an established view, an established political perspective, the idea that Fox News is always and always Republican, and that Obama will always remain a cactus in their eyes. These kinds of things always happen. And that's why in our generation, we are becoming skeptical of the media, unfortunately. We're being skeptical of what journalists write, we're being skeptical of their perspectives. We want to find out.
Point of information.
Yes, well, yes, sir.
If social media is the greatest threat, why have you just used a lot of examples from traditional media to explain why journalism is doomed?
Because I'm just trying to explain how traditional media is receding and receding and receding. Because you have to look at how they're aging to see how they're dying off. Ladies and gentlemen, just as how we're looking at you right now. So let's continue this whole idea. For example, do we actually need a journalist to tell us about these things? We have photos of the Syrian chemical warfare straight in your face, seeing children dying in front of your eyes on Twitter. Do you necessarily need AP to write an article on that to tell you that these people are dying? We don't necessarily think so. And finally, on this idea that newspapers are rising across the world. A particular example provided here was Luxembourg, a very small country in Europe and a tax haven with lots of different companies, not so much people, ladies and gentlemen. And what we really think is when traditional huge journals like Newsweek is crashing down and bankrupt, the biggest magazines in the world. The Washington Post has resorted to saying, Jeff Bezos is buying me, he must have some new ideas. You will see how traditional journalism is simply dying off, and they need to rely on the new levels of internet entrepreneurs to save them with the new ideas of social media, with us young people saving the old. So, let's go back to the major news sources. This whole idea of my extensive on this idea of audience distributing information. Why do we think journalism is losing on this front? First thing we look at is just blatant exactly YOLO. Let's see what's everyone talking about YOLO. Let's talk about Syria, hashtag Syrian children, all these kinds of things. People are using these kinds of methods, following celebrities, hashtags for major issues, to
Point of information if I can try again.
Feed, no thank you sir, for their information themselves. What we're seeing here is that we're looking at a large-scale audience that is accessible to the major public and also entirely personalized to our needs. And that's why we think that people love social media far more than the news. And that's also why over 50% of Americans heard about news straight from social media before official news sources. The reason why is because they use even their own, no thank you Rachel, even their own social lives are entirely focused on these areas. Now finally I want to talk about empowerment. This idea that we are actively engaged in news now because we're becoming more and more active in this regard. People are creating and distributing content for like larger scale than ever before. When the Boston bombings happened, we saw a huge increase of tweets from the surrounding areas of Boston. While all of those residents there were tweeting about the event. They were taking photos, they were showing their friends about how the Boston bombing has just happened. We didn't need AP to tell us about it because we saw the buildings explode in front of our eyes. That is the power of social media. That's how the sources of the event at the scene talk to us directly. So ladies and gentlemen, what exactly are we trying to bring to you today? It might sound very haunting. It might sound like a future that is very unfamiliar to us. But the truth is that even things like newspapers used to never exist. People tried to hear about things, they didn't have people tell them about information. But now we have the sources of events from every corner of the world being tweeted to us directly. They're showing us what they mean, they're showing us their perspective. And this is far more valuable than what simply a journalist can do. That's why we think this motion stands. Thank you.
Ms. Rachel Evans.
Passing away versus the importance of journalism upholding the notion of truth. I thought it was quite interesting that James mentioned the Boston bombings. When Boston was unfortunately bombed, social media was on fire. But unfortunately, they identified the wrong guy as the bomber. He was lambasted, his mum was informed. It wasn't a particularly nice thing for his family to happen, and it didn't help the police get any closer to catching the Boston bombers. So in that respect, social media has kind of a dangerous impact as well on the truth. Social media has the benefit of trying to sort of create a debate out there, to provide crowdsourcing, to help people get their ideas across. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't differentiate between truth and rumour. It doesn't allow people to identify what is in fact actually happening versus what people think they might have seen. Also, James mentioned that Syria, we see pictures of children dying. Do we know where these children are dying? Do we know who has killed them? Do we know what has killed them? The danger with having pictures from unidentified sources, from unidentified places, is that we ascribe certain views, certain positions to them, and we read into things that aren't necessarily what is actually happening on the ground. For all we know, these kids have been killed somewhere else. Unfortunately, they're still dead, but they're not necessarily a result of government forces killing rebel children, or rebel forces killing government children. We need some context. And that's where journalism really comes to play. That's where social media helps inform journalism. We have posts coming in through Twitter, we have posts coming in through Facebook. The Arab Spring was a fantastic example of how social media can inform journalism and how journalism can contribute to social media. What we do in journalism is we take all of our sources coming in from all different areas, and we try to work out who is telling the truth and what level of truth they are actually telling us. In terms of a debate, you never have one side of a story. You always have different views and different perspectives coming through to you. Social media allows us to see a vast or far wider range of views than we would be able to do through traditional means of news sourcing. It's therefore a very valid source for us. It's also a very valid way in which we can reach out to people with our stories and say, hey, this is the news you may have seen on Twitter, you may have seen, and it's an unkind of original, but this is what it really means. This is why you care. When it comes comes to working on Bloomberg, which is what I do on the bond side, Natalie mentioned in the first debate that this is an age where users don't care if it's accurate. Absolute poppycock. When traders come to trading and stuff, they absolutely care if it's accurate. They absolutely care if Indonesia has raised rates or whatever, because their decisions that they are going to buy or sell stocks or bonds on absolutely rely on whether something is accurate or inaccurate. And in terms of kind of the wider political environment, if we have tweets from Al-Qaeda, for example, saying that they're about to go and bomb somewhere, we've got as well want to know that it's right, that somebody is actually verifying this account and saying, well, is this actually Al-Qaeda that is talking to us? There was a blog that came out of Syria.
Right, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Right. The reality is that the internet also checks whether these sources are actually true. When sources start spoofing, after they do it once, they will never be able to do it again because it spreads all across the internet and the crowd actually understands.
That's absolutely right, but the problem is that you don't have that real time. With journalists, before we write anything, before we go on the air, before we print, before we tweet, we are checking and verifying our sources. So when you read something that a journalist has written on social media or in more traditional journalism, you know that it's been verified. You know that people have actually gone out, spoken to the source, made sure that they are actually telling you the truth. So therefore, when you read something from AP's Twitter account, or you read something on the Times, whatever, you know that there has been a certain level of verification, and you can believe it. As I was going to mention, when we had the Syria crisis initially erupting, we had a blog of a gay woman in Syria. Turned out it was a bloke writing from Scotland. No one bothered to verify, everybody retweeted. It's a classic example of how accuracy can get blurred by people not checking the sources, and how social media, as a kind of, a wonderful democratisation of journalism, still requires journalism to be there very much at the centre. You cannot have social media without journalism, and you cannot have journalism these days without social media. The two are together. As Nick pointed out in our first speech, it's about an evolution. It's not about kind of one thing supplanting the other and suddenly everybody's a journalist. Not the case. Everybody is suddenly a part of journalism. It's a fantastic opportunity for journalists to be able to engage with a wider community than they might otherwise have done. Instead of having to rely on people kind of going into the paper shop and buying a newspaper, or buying a TV channel, or turning on the radio at the hour to hear the news. Instead, we can engage with people on a minute-by-minute basis once we have verified the facts. What people are not getting from social media...
So what you're basically saying is that news is no longer the chief collector nor the chief distributor of news, but only the fact checker of the huge amounts of sources open to public. Is that true?
I'd argue that news is not news unless it's true. Unless something is true, it is not news. If it's not true, it's just a rumour. If it hasn't been verified, if people have not gone out to the sources and said, hey, is this true? We hear XYZ is happening. That's not news. That's just gossip. That's just the rumour mill working full. That's what social media is great at doing. But that's why it needs journalists. If journalists are going to actually take advantage of the medium, social media needs them to try and push forward the goal that I guess we all have of truth and reporting and actually making people better informed about their environment. Social media does not provide that. Social media provides an awful lot of information, an awful lot of noise. What you need is somebody cutting through that crap and saying, this is the truth. This is what you should believe. This is true because I have gone and I have spoken to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sources.